Why was the city so quiet? Lieutenant Susan and Cuddy adjusted the scope on her Barrett M82, the metal cold against her cheek, the air thick with the silence that comes before everything goes wrong. Novgorod, once a living, breathing city, now lay broken under the gray light of dawn. Every building was a scar, every window a watching eye. Beside her, Lieutenant Nancy Harkness Love tightened her grip on her M4A5, her movements sharp, controlled, but her pulse betrayed her. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. It was something heavier. Something that felt like the edge of purpose, and the weight of everything riding on tonight. They called them the Ghost Sisters, a name whispered in barracks and denied in every official record. Two women who had done what few ever dared. Turned the world's doubts into ammunition. They weren't supposed to exist. Not like this. Not in the middle of an operation that pitted them, two shadows, against 20 U.S. Navy SEALs. Susan exhaled slowly, her breath ghosting into the icy air. Winds shifting, Nancy murmured, scanning the skyline through her optic. 3 knots easterly. Susan adjusted her calculations by instinct, the rhythm of years of discipline guiding every movement. The Barrett settled into her shoulder like an old friend. Down below, through the haze of early morning, the SEALs were coming. 20 of them. Moving through the ruins with lethal precision, their formation perfect, their discipline a thing of quiet poetry. Led by Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, a man whose reputation carried the kind of gravity that could make even the air around him seem sharper. He didn't lead from behind. He was always first through the door, always the last to leave. And tonight, he had no idea what waited above him. Susan checked her tactical pad. Encrypted message confirmed. Operation Velvet Vigil, green light. Engage. She frowned, the words digging deeper than they should have. Their orders were unconventional. Disrupt the SEAL operation without casualties. Each shot must disable, not destroy. Each round had to protect the very people hunting them, without the SEALs ever realizing it. She swallowed that irony like a bitter pill. Because this wasn't just another field test. This was their test. The first female-led sniper operation in an active simulation zone. A chance to prove that women could hold the line, not just in records or research papers, but in fire and steel. And failure wasn't an option. Failure meant the door they'd kicked open would slam shut for every woman coming after them. Susan's eyes flicked through her scope. Movement, dark figures slicing through the fog. She tracked them, breathing steady, heart slow. 15, no 17. The rest were circling the south quadrant, just like command predicted. The SEALs were ghosts themselves, efficient, silent, methodical. Their communication needed no words, just subtle hand signals and instinctive trust. They were the best of the best. And they were walking straight into a trap. Ready, Susan whispered. Nancy nodded once, always. Susan's finger tightened on the trigger. And the first shot broke the silence like a heartbeat, restarting the dead. Crack! A kilometer away, the lock on a security door exploded into metal dust. Down below, the SEALs froze, their heads snapping toward the source. No one spoke. No one panicked. But they felt it, the awareness of being seen. That'll slow them, Susan said softly, chambering another round. Nancy fired next, her bullet slicing through a power line. The compound plunged into darkness. Now the game had begun. Both women shifted positions, their movements silent as the dust falling through the old clock tower. Years of training with Colonel Meryl Tangestal, the first African-American woman to pilot a U-2 spy plane, had burned one rule into their bones: never fire twice from the same place. They moved like wind, always unseen, always untraceable. Each shot they fired hurted the SEALs subtly, forcing them to change routes, to delay, to adapt. It wasn't war, it was chess. And every piece they moved brought them closer to the truth of the mission. But O'Hare wasn't like other commanders. Within minutes, he changed formation. Half his team spread out, forming wide counter-sniper coverage. The other half advanced with micro-drones, mapping rooftops, scanning heat signatures. They were adapting faster than anyone expected. Susan watched him through her scope. He was calm, efficient, deadly precise. And she could tell by the way he moved. He already knew. "There are two of us," she murmured. Nancy smirked faintly. "Took him long enough." Her next shot wasn't at a soldier. It hit a wall just above the SEALs. The round detonated into a fine red powder that drifted like blood mist in the dawn light. The Ghost Sisters' calling card. Every operator in the region knew it. A mark that said, "We were here, we could have ended this, but we chose not to." Down below, O'Hare looked up through the crimson haze. His expression didn't change, but when he spoke into his comms, his voice carried a new tone, part warning, part awe. "Ghost Sisters confirmed. Switch to Counter-Sniper Protocol Delta." Susan and Nancy exchanged a look. The kind that said the game has changed. The SEALs vanished into smoke, deploying grenades that cloaked the ruins in drifting gray fog. Drones rose like tiny insects, their red sensors sweeping the skyline. The city became a battlefield of echoes and angles. "They're adapting too fast," Susan whispered. Nancy was already breaking down her rifle. "Then we move faster." They slipped through the crumbling stairwell of the old tower, boots silent on broken concrete. Seconds later, the place they'd been was shredded by return fire, precise, deadly, and merciless. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest. By sunrise, the light over Novgorod turned gold, soft, and cruel at once. Bullets had stopped flying. For a moment, it looked peaceful. But beneath that peace, the battle raged in silence, every mind calculating, every trigger waiting. From a new position overlooking the east sector, Nancy aligned her scope. Her shots struck water tanks, disabling communications gear, puncturing drones before they could signal. Not killing, just frustrating. She smiled grimly. "Let's see how long the Navy's best lasts without their toys." 3 hours in, tension replaced adrenaline. Every movement, every heartbeat had meaning now. The SEALs, men trained to dominate, were being played. Guided, redirected, controlled. And though none of them knew it, every step they took was part of something larger. A silent test that would decide the future of women in combat. O'Hare, sensing the shift, changed tactics again. He split his remaining forces, 10 to flank the north, 10 to secure the extraction zone. He didn't know it yet, but that split would change everything. Nancy tracked their movement through the scope. "They're splitting up," she said. "If they reach the compound before we complete the sequence." She didn't finish, she didn't have to. Because they both knew what was at stake. Failure here wouldn't just end a mission. It would end careers. It would erase proof that they belonged here at all. Then came the sound. A deep, echoing boom from below. The kind that shakes the bones before it reaches the ears. The tower trembled, dust fell like snow. "The SEALs breached the lower floors," Nancy shouted. "Time to move," Susan ordered. But before she could rise, a second explosion ripped through the structure. Concrete cracked like thunder. A shard of rebar tore across Susan's leg, opening her flesh with brutal precision. She fell hard, clutching her thigh. Blood pooled quickly, dark against her uniform. "I'm hit," she said, voice flat, steady, calm. The voice of a soldier assessing damage, not pain. "Not arterial, I'll manage." Nancy crouched beside her, torn between duty and instinct. They both knew the truth. One of them had to go. One had to stay behind. Susan reached into her pack, pulled out the targeting module, a sleek, black device no larger than a phone. 15 more tags to mark. That was all that stood between them and validation. She pressed it into Nancy's hands. "Go," she said. "I'll buy you time." Nancy shook her head. "Sue." "Go." The word cracked like a rifle shot. Their eyes met, years of training, laughter, and survival compressed into a single look. No words, no promises. Just understanding. Then Nancy was gone, sliding through a maintenance shaft as Susan dragged herself across the floor, rifle in hand. Below, the SEALs breached the stairwell, silent, efficient, ruthless. Susan fired. 1 shot. 2. 3. Each round disabled equipment, night vision, flashlights, comm units. She never missed. Not once. And every second she brought Nancy closer to finishing the mission. The pain in her leg was nothing now. The sound of footsteps grew closer. And through the dust and smoke, she smiled faintly, not from defiance but from pride. Because if this was the end, at least it was hers to write. Above the city, Nancy ran through rooftops that crumbled underfoot, across bridges made of shadow and fear. The clock tower faded behind her, but Susan's voice echoed in her ear. The mission wasn't over. Not until the last tag was marked. Not until the world finally saw them for what they were. Not ghosts. Not women trying to prove something. But soldiers as good as any, as brave as any, as human as any. And as she reached the next ridge, the dawn hit her face like fire. The kind of light that doesn't just illuminate. It tests you. Why did it feel like the city itself was hunting them? Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare crouched behind the burned-out shell of an armored van, his M4A1 angled low, his breathing controlled. The smell of cordite and dust lingered in the air, faint but sharp enough to sting. His HUD flickered with static from the interference that had been plaguing them since dawn. Somewhere above, a sniper watched. Or maybe 2. He wasn't sure anymore. The shot patterns were too precise, too patient. No kills, no bodies. Only precision hits, optics, radios, locks, drones. Someone was sending a message. O'Hare glanced at the faint red powder still clinging to the walls near the breach point. He'd heard the rumors, same as everyone else. 2 women, no official record, no confirmed missions, just a name whispered like a ghost story in the training halls, the Ghost Sisters. He'd never believed in ghosts until now. Team 1 advanced through Grid 6, he ordered quietly over comms. Keep your heads down and watch your signatures. Drones are blind, we're running analog. Static answered him, then Sergeant Tor's calm voice. Copy that, sir. But if they're who you think they are, we're not the hunters tonight. O'Hare didn't respond. He didn't have to. He already knew. He scanned the rooftops through his optic, but the city was a maze, 1,000 windows, every one a potential barrel. He'd been in firefights that felt like chaos. This wasn't chaos. This was orchestration. Every move he made felt predicted. Every angle anticipated. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to win. They were trying to prove something. Across the city, Nancy slid behind a collapsed billboard and checked the targeting module Susan had given her. 15 more tags, that's all, just 15. But each one felt like a mountain now. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when Susan might already be surrounded. Not when years of being dismissed, doubted, and sidelined had led to this one razor-thin chance at proving they belonged here. She lined up her scope. 1 SEAL moved into position near a comms crate, perfect. She exhaled. Squeezed. Thump. The non-lethal round hit the crate, tagging the signal relay on his pack. 1 more mark confirmed. Nancy closed her eyes for half a second. The rhythm was coming back. Focus, calm, control. She trained for chaos like this, but not for the silence that followed. The kind that made her wonder if Susan was still breathing. "Come on, partner," she whispered into the wind. "Stay with me." Back in the clock tower, Susan dragged herself across the cold concrete, blood marking her trail in uneven smears. She was fatting fast, but pain was just another sound now, something her mind filed away for later. Below her, seals were moving up the stairwell. She could hear the clink of gear. The low hand signals passed in silence. 3 of them. Maybe 4. She steadied her rifle and waited. The shot had to count. Not to kill, but to speak. When the first seal appeared in her scope, she didn't see an enemy. She saw one of her own. The kind of soldier who'd never know that the person above him was protecting him from a trap designed to swallow them all. She fired. The bullet shattered his goggles, sending him diving for cover. No blood, just confusion. She fired again, disabling the team's night vision pack. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was guilt. Because she knew what would happen when they found her. And yet she smiled faintly, painfully, because she'd bought Nancy more time. O'Hare studied the new damage reports streaming across his feed. Equipment failure, comms loss, power relay offline. Each incident came from a different angle, different range. He clenched his jaw. 2 shooters working in tandem. High ground advantage, coordinated intervals of 47 seconds. He'd seen elite precision before, Rangers, SEALs, even Delta, but this felt surgical. "Murphy," he called to his second in command, "we're being herded." "By who?" Murphy asked, crouching beside him. O'Hare pointed toward the broken clock tower that dominated the skyline. "By someone who knows exactly how we think." Nancy darted across a shattered street, her boots splashing through puddles that glowed faintly from leaking coolant. She checked her watch, 23 minutes to complete the marking sequence. Her hands trembled from fatigue, but her focus stayed razor-sharp. Through the shattered window of an old cathedral, she spotted 3 SEALs advancing through the debris. She hesitated. For a heartbeat, she considered revealing herself, telling them they weren't under attack, that the mission wasn't what it seemed. But orders were orders. And Susan's voice echoed in her head, "They can't know, not until it's done." So she fired again, tagging their equipment, guiding them away from the ambush zone. Another round, another confirmation on the module. 12 marks now. Only 12. She ducked behind a pew, chest heaving, her mind flickering through memories of the training days, of being told, over and over, that she didn't belong in combat. One colonel had once said it bluntly. Women hesitate, that hesitation gets people killed. Tonight, she was proving him wrong with every breath she took. O'Hare's team reached the base of the clock tower. "Breaching," Torres whispered. The door exploded inward, smoke billowing through the stairwell. O'Hare's instincts screamed trap, but there was no time to hesitate. They swept the lower levels clear. 2nd floor clear. 3rd floor. Contact. Gunfire erupted, short bursts disciplined. Rounds pinged off metal beams, controlled and deliberate. No kill shots. O'Hare ducked behind a pillar, heart pounding. "She's up there," Murphy called. "One shooter wounded, precision hits only." "Hold fire," O'Hare ordered. "Repeat, hold fire." He didn't know why he said it, maybe instinct, maybe respect, but something told him this wasn't the kind of fight you ended with bullets. They moved cautiously up the final staircase. At the top landing, through the drifting dust, O'Hare saw her. Susan sat against a wall, rifle across her lap, leg wrapped in blood-soaked gauze. Her expression wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion, the kind that came after carrying too much for too long. "Lieutenant Cuddy," O'Hare said quietly, lowering his weapon. "You already know who I am," she replied, voice rough but steady. "Then you know this isn't what it looks like." He glanced around. The room was littered with shell casings, but no bodies. No blood trails except hers. "Talk," he said, fast. Susan nodded toward the device on her vest, a transmitter linked to the targeting module. "We were ordered to tag, not kill. Non-lethal field test. Classified, we're not your enemy." O'Hare studied her for a long moment, the logic clicking together like puzzle pieces. Her precision, the patterns, the missing casualties. It made sense, terrifying, brilliant sense. He tapped his comm. "Murphy, stand down. Repeat, all teams stand down." Nancy's earpiece crackled with static. Then O'Hare's voice. "We've secured the other sniper. She's wounded but stable." Her heart seized. "Susan." "Copy that," Nancy whispered, her hands trembling. "How many unaccounted?" 13, came the reply. 13 still in the field. 13 tags left. She forced herself to breathe. Susan had bought her the chance to finish this. She couldn't waste it. But then a sound behind her. A click. A safety switch. She froze. Cold metal pressed against the back of her neck. A calm male voice said, "Now, let's talk about what you're really doing here." O'Hare's radio came alive with Murphy's strained whisper. "Sir, I've got something." O'Hare frowned. "Report." "Sniper 2 located, unarmed, claims she's on our side." "Is she?" Murphy hesitated. "She's got something you need to see." The man behind Nancy, Lieutenant Murphy, didn't lower his weapon, but his voice softened just slightly. "You've had 26 chances to kill my men," he said. "You didn't take one. Why?" Nancy slowly turned her head, hands still raised. "Because we weren't supposed to. This mission wasn't about taking lives. It was about saving them." "Prove it." She nodded toward the targeting module on the ground. "Check it, the readouts." Murphy kept his rifle trained as he picked up the device. The screen flickered, displaying a grid of signals, each tagged with a bright marker. "Tracking data, not kills." He frowned. "These aren't kills. They're tags," she said. "Every single one of your men is accounted for." Before Murphy could respond, O'Hare's voice came through again, calm, low, final. "We've confirmed, stand down, everyone." The words rippled through the comm net like thunder after a storm. Susan sat in silence as the SEALs secured the perimeter. Through the broken windows, the sun had begun to fall, painting Novgorod in the colors of fire and forgiveness. She didn't move when O'Hare approached. He crouched beside her, eyes level. "You hit every target," he said quietly. 38 for 38. She managed a faint smile. "Close enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no need. Around them, the world was still broken, but maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. A boundary erased. A silence ending. Across the street, Nancy watched the SEALs gather. Susan was alive. The mission was complete. And for the first time in her career, she felt something close to peace. Because sometimes, victory didn't come from pulling the trigger. Sometimes it came from holding your fire. She slung her rifle, whispering to herself as the last light faded behind the ruins. Some targets aren't meant to fall, they're meant to understand. What happens after the gunfire stops? No one ever talks about that part. Not the silence that follows. Not the weight of the things you didn't say. Or the lives you didn't take. Lieutenant Susan and Cuddy sat on a metal bench in a makeshift medical bay, the hum of portable generators filling the space where voices wouldn't. Her leg was wrapped in white gauze, still leaking through. She didn't feel the pain anymore, just the ache of waiting. Across the room, through a sheet of dusty plexiglass, she could see Nancy packing. Still geared up, still wired from adrenaline, but her eyes were somewhere else, far away back in the city that nearly swallowed them both. Neither woman had spoken since the extraction. There hadn't been time. They'd been airlifted out by the same SEALs they just outmaneuvered. No cuffs, no words, just silence and the sound of rotor blades. Respect maybe, or confusion. Susan didn't know which felt heavier. A young corpsman entered, checking her vitals without meeting her eyes. The patch on his sleeve read Navy Special Warfare Command. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. They all didn't. Even when Lieutenant O'Hare walked in, flanked by his second, there was that same quiet. A silence not of anger, but of calculation. O'Hare set his helmet down on the metal table. "Lieutenant Cuddy," he said evenly, "you mind telling me what the hell just happened out there?" Susan met his gaze, calm as the barrel of her rifle. "I think you already know." He studied her for a long moment. "I know you hit every one of my men's rigs without drawing blood. I know you ran a 2-person operation against 20 SEALs and lasted 7 hours. And I know you refused to fire a lethal round even when we breached your position." He leaned forward. "What I don't know is why." Susan's expression didn't shift. She'd been debriefed enough times to understand that tone, the mixture of curiosity and controlled disbelief. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't the one under suspicion. She was the proof. "Orders," she said simply, "classified under Operation Velvet Vigil." O'Hare exchanged a look with Murphy. "I checked that code name," he said. "It doesn't exist." Susan's voice softened. "It will soon." Nancy stood outside, wind whipping at her hair, the horizon a bleeding line of amber and smoke. The base around her buzzed with recovery ops, SEALs rearming, medics checking gear, drones being packed into crates. Everything looked normal, efficient, procedural. Except for her. She didn't belong to this rhythm anymore. Not after what they'd just done. She reached for her canteen, hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind the hollow exhaustion of survival. Her mind replayed Susan's voice go, "I'll buy you time." And the sound of the explosion that followed. Nancy closed her eyes. She trained her whole life to think fast, act faster, never doubt. But what haunted her wasn't the mission. It was the moment she almost stayed. The moment she almost disobeyed. She opened her eyes when she heard boots approaching. O'Hare stopped beside her, silent for a moment. Neither saluted, neither smiled. "You two were never supposed to cross paths with us," he said finally. Nancy nodded. "I figured. You could have killed half my team in under a minute." "Wasn't the mission." O'Hare studied her face. There was something there he hadn't expected. Not pride, not defiance, just quiet fatigue. "You believe in what you were doing." Nancy looked at him. "I believe in who I was doing it for." He didn't ask who, he didn't have to. 3 hours later, they were flown to a secure site deep in the Bavarian Alps. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was where the military sent questions it couldn't answer in public. The facility was cold and spotless, steel corridors, reinforced glass, and guards who never blinked long enough to think. Susan was placed in an interview room that smelled of antiseptic and paperwork. Nancy was brought in 10 minutes later, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. No greeting, no hug, just a nod that said we made it. A woman entered the room, her steps steady, deliberate. Silver hair, immaculate uniform, the calm authority of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Colonel Anna May Hayes. First woman in U.S. military history to wear a general's star. And the architect behind Velvet Vigil. "Ladies," she said, closing the door behind her, You've caused quite the storm. Susan managed a tired half-smile. Storms make people look up, ma'am. Hayes's eyes glinted, and lightning gets their attention. She placed a tablet on the table and tapped the screen. Footage filled the wall display, thermal imaging from drones, SEAL body cams, satellite overlays. Every red dot a hit. 38. Every single target marked. Hayes didn't speak for a long moment, then softly. Perfect score. Nancy exhaled, the sound almost a laugh, almost a sob. So it worked, she whispered. It did, Hayes replied, beyond expectations. Susan sat forward. Then why do I feel like we're about to be erased? Hayes looked at her, unreadable. Because perfection threatens the people who promised it couldn't exist. The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Outside the briefing chamber, O'Hare and Murphy waited, confined to a separate corridor. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Murphy said, "You think they'll bury it?" O'Hare's jaw tightened. "They'll try, but you can't bury what already changed the field." He looked through the glass wall toward the two women being questioned. "I've seen a lot of operators crack under pressure. Those two didn't crack. They chose restraint. That's harder than pulling the trigger." Murphy nodded. "Hell of a thing, watching discipline like that. Makes you question what kind of courage we've been measuring all these years." O'Hare didn't reply. He didn't need to. He'd been measuring it too, and found his own yardstick wanting. Back in the room, Hayes turned off the screen and leaned forward. "You understand what this means," she said quietly. "The system works, the tech's ready, but that's not what matters." Nancy frowned. "Then what does?" Hayes's voice softened. "You two proved something the Pentagon didn't want proven, that precision and empathy can exist in the same soldier. That strength isn't louder when it kills, it's louder when it chooses not to." Susan's throat tightened. "So what happens now?" Hayes smiled faintly. "Now, you rest, you heal, and then you decide whether you want to lead the next generation who will wear your shadow." Nancy blinked. "Next generation." Hayes turned the tablet around. On the screen, names, photos, dossiers. Young women, Marines, Air Force, Navy. All candidates for a newly approved sniper integration program. Susan stared at the list. After all these years of resistance, skepticism, and dismissal, it was real. It was happening. But behind the relief was something colder. She remembered the faces of the SEALs they'd targeted, the confusion in their eyes, the tension that could have ignited into tragedy if even one round had strayed. "Ma'am," she said softly, "we almost crossed a line out there." Hayes nodded. "Every first step crosses one. The question is whether the ground behind it was worth burning." Later that night, the sisters sat alone on the facility's roof, wrapped in gray blankets, sipping lukewarm coffee that tasted like sand. Below them, the compound lights shimmered through fog. The war felt far away now, almost imaginary. Nancy broke the silence first. "You ever think about what would have happened if we failed?" Susan looked at her, the corner of her mouth twitching into a tired smile. "We wouldn't have been allowed to think about it." Nancy laughed softly, shaking her head. "We're ghosts, remember. We don't get tombstones." Susan took another sip, then set her cup down. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. "Do you ever get tired of proving it? Every day, every mission, like we have to keep showing them we belong." Nancy's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Yeah," she whispered, "but then I think about the ones watching, the ones who'll never have to prove it the way we did. That's enough for me." Susan nodded slowly. "That's the thing about ghosts," she said. "We fade so others can stand." Down in the command center, Colonel Hayes watched the live feed from the roof camera. She didn't interrupt, didn't speak, just listened. Because in that moment, she knew the test had measured more than marksmanship. It had measured humanity. She turned off the monitor, whispering almost to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. How do you come home from something no one's allowed to know you did? 6 months after Novgorod, Lieutenant Susan and Cuddy still woke before dawn, the way she had on the roof of that clock tower. Same ritual, same silence. Only the view had changed. Now it was the Nevada desert stretching to forever, the air thick with dust, and the hum of turbines from the training range beyond. Officially, this was a testing facility. Unofficially, it was where tomorrow's soldiers were being written into existence. The Ghost Sisters were instructors now. Legends in whispers, ghosts in daylight. From the tower balcony of the firing range, Susan watched a line of new recruits line up their rifles, men and women both, steadying under the heat. Each trigger pull was followed by a distant clang from steel targets. Precise, controlled. Nancy walked up beside her, hands in her pockets, sunglasses hiding the exhaustion neither of them could fully shake. "Not bad," she said. "Not great," Susan answered. Nancy smirked. "You're impossible to please." "I'm not trying to please, I'm trying to prepare." The wind shifted. The smell of gunpowder drifted between them. "You still think about it?" Nancy asked quietly. Susan didn't answer. But the way her fingers tightened on the railing said enough. 2,000 miles away, the Pentagon conference room buzzed under fluorescent light. Colonel Anna May Hayes stood before a table of men in dark suits and polished metals. Behind her, a screen displayed the words, "Velvet Vigil, Post-Field Evaluation." "The system has proven reliable under urban and live-fire conditions," Hayes reported. "The non-lethal precision tags have been approved for special operations integration starting next quarter." A general cleared his throat. "Congratulations, Colonel, but your operators, the women, they're a problem." Hayes's tone never wavered. "A problem." "They've become symbols," the man said. "The media's catching wind. Questions about their records, the mission, their command authority." Hayes interrupted, softly but firmly. "Symbols can't be erased, General, only lead." Another voice chimed in. "Still, we can't risk the publicity. Keep them training off record. No interviews, no names." She nodded once. But inside she knew the truth. Hiding them would only make their shadow larger. That night, Susan sat alone in her barracks. The lights were low, her legs still ached in the rain. A small box sat on her desk, the silver star she and Nancy had received in a closed ceremony. No cameras, no applause, just a folded flag and quiet handshakes. She turned the medal over in her palm. Shiny, heavy, meaningless. A knock at the door. Nancy leaned in. "You're missing the fun," she said. "Recruits are celebrating. Someone just hit a 900-meter target." Susan smiled faintly. "Good for them." Nancy stepped inside, dropping onto the bunk opposite her. "You can't keep living in the tower, Sue." "I'm not." "You are. You're still there every time you close your eyes." Susan exhaled slowly. "You ever wonder if we did the right thing?" Nancy frowned. "You mean saving 20 SEALs and proving the entire system wrong?" "Yeah, I lose sleep over that every night." But Susan's voice stayed flat. "I mean playing their game, letting them test us like weapons instead of trusting us like soldiers." Nancy went quiet. Because that right there was the wound that never healed. Weeks passed. The desert heat blurred into habit, days of drills, nights of reports, endless instruction. But one evening, Colonel Hayes arrived unannounced. Her convoy rolled up in a cloud of sand and authority. Susan and Nancy saluted, surprised. Hayes returned it with a tired smile. "At ease, lieutenants, we've got a situation." Inside the briefing room, maps of Kyrgyzstan glowed on the wall, mountain passes, red markers, satellite images. Hayes pointed to a blinking zone near the border. American humanitarian convoy ambushed, local insurgents, 2 hostages taken, aid workers. We're sending a recovery team. Susan leaned forward, SEALs. Negative, this mission's black. You two are going with a recon unit as advisors. Nancy frowned, why us? Hayes paused. Because the ambush zone sits inside an old Soviet radar field, high civilian density. We can't risk collateral, we need precision, and we need empathy. The word landed heavy. Empathy, the same thing that had saved lives in Novgorod, was now the only thing keeping this new mission from becoming another cover-up. 3 days later, the wind howled through the frozen ridges of the Tian Shan Mountains. Snow cracked under boots. The Ghost Sisters were ghosts again, painted in white, rifles cradled, eyes scanning through scope fog. Susan's breath came slow through the mask. Wind 6 knots west, she murmured. Nancy adjusted. Range 600, 2 guards outside the structure, no clear line on hostages. They waited. Minutes stretched thin. The recon unit hunkered behind them. Young soldiers who'd grown up hearing their names whispered in training. For the first time, Susan felt the weight of expectation heavier than her rifle. They weren't just operators anymore, they were proof. Through the scope movement. One hostage, a young woman, dragged to the doorway. A gun pressed to her temple. Nancy's finger twitched toward the trigger. Shots clean. Negative, Susan whispered, not yet. She could hear the young woman crying. A sound she'd heard before in another language, another lifetime. Her mind flashed to Novgorod, the silence, the restraint, the blood she'd refused to spill. This was supposed to be easier. It was. Now, Nancy said, urgency tightening her voice. Susan hesitated. A breath, a blink, a decision. Crack. The rifle kicked. The guard fell, non-lethal shoulder shot. The second guard spun, panicking, shouting. Nancy's round hit his weapon clean out of his hands. 2 shots, 2 lives spared. The hostages were pulled to safety seconds later. Target secure, Susan reported. Her voice was calm, but inside something trembled. That half-second hesitation, it had almost cost a life. Old doubts, old ghosts. Back at base, the debrief was quiet. The mission a success. 0 casualties. But Susan couldn't shake the feeling she'd failed something invisible, some standard she'd set for herself back in the ruins of Novgorod. That night, she found Hayes waiting outside the hangar. The colonel's hands were clasped behind her back, her breath fogging in the cold. Good work out there, Hayes said softly. Susan stared at the horizon. I hesitated. That hesitation saved a civilian. It almost cost her. Hayes turned to her. You're not machines, Susan. The point was never perfection. It was proving that humanity belongs on the battlefield. Susan looked down, the weight of those words sinking deep. Sometimes humanity feels like a weakness. Hayes smiled, weary but certain. Then you're still the right one to have it. When she returned to her quarters, Nancy was already there, cleaning her rifle, humming under her breath. Susan sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable for once. Think this one makes the news? Nancy asked. Susan shook her head, not our kind of story. Yeah, Nancy said with a grin, too many survivors. They both laughed, soft, tired, real. The kind of laughter that happens when you've been carrying ghosts too long and finally remember you're still alive. Outside, the desert wind howled against the walls, same as Novgorod's did against the tower. But this time, it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like continuation. Because maybe this was the truth they'd been searching for all along. You don't win by hitting every target. You win by deciding which ones you'll never take. What happens when the mission you believe in stops believing in you? The cargo bay rattled as the transport banked over the Black Sea. Inside, dim red light washed across helmets and rifles. Susan sat strapped in, eyes closed, listening to the slow rhythm of the engines. Every vibration felt like a memory she couldn't shake. Novgorod, the clock tower, the hesitation that still lived somewhere behind her ribs. Nancy sat opposite her, polishing her scope. No music, no talk. They didn't need it anymore. Their silence had its own language. Colonel Hayes' voice came through the comm. Operation Solstice. Primary objective: extract civilian asset from a hostile research site. Secondary: neutralize any threat to the data servers. Minimal exposure. Non-lethal engagement protocols remain in effect. Susan opened her eyes. Same rules. Nancy nodded. Same ghosts. The insertion zone lay in the Caucasus foothills. An abandoned observatory complex turned insurgent relay. Night wind cut through the pines. Frost glittered like shrapnel under the moon. They moved fast and low, with a four-person recon element. No chatter. Just the crunch of snow and the creak of metal as doors were breached one by one. Inside the main dome, computer racks hummed behind sandbags. A man sat at the center, the target, a data scientist who defected weeks earlier. He raised his hands instantly. "I'm not armed." But before Susan could lower her rifle, a young corporal behind her shouted, "Contact!" A burst of gunfire tore through the darkness. Glass shattered. Sparks cascaded across the floor. When it cleared, the corporal was down, his shoulder bleeding, and the shooter, a teenage guard barely 16, trembled at the far door, weapon shaking in his hands. Susan steadied her aim. The boy's eyes met hers. Fear. Nothing else. "Stand down," Nancy hissed beside her. But command crackled in her ear. "Target hostile. Engage." Susan froze. Everything inside her screamed no. He wasn't a combatant, he was terrified. But protocol didn't care about terror. The boy's finger tightened on his trigger. A split second. Choice compressed into heartbeat. Susan fired. The round struck the rifle stock, shattering it from his grip. The boy collapsed, sobbing, alive. Silence followed, heavy, disbelieving. Command barked again. Cuddy confirmed neutralization. She clicked the comm off. No confirmation. No apology. They exfiltrated 32 minutes later with the scientist and the wounded corporal. Mission success by every metric that mattered to paper. But inside the chopper, the air was colder than the mountain wind. Nancy leaned toward her. "You did the right thing." Susan stared at her hands. "Then why does it feel wrong?" Nancy didn't answer. Because she felt it too. The thin line between saving and disobeying, between moral and military. Back at base, the debrief was clinical. Command praised their precision, their restraint. No one mentioned the boy. No one ever would. Afterwards, Susan found herself walking aimlessly through the hangar, past rows of drones gleaming under fluorescent light. Every machine looked perfect. Predictable. Safe. She envied them. "Lieutenant." Hayes's voice broke the silence. She stepped from the shadows, coat draped over her arm. "Word is you disobeyed a direct order." Susan turned slowly. "I followed the mission parameters, non-lethal engagement." Hayes studied her for a long beat. "And saved a child. I read the feed. I also read the order." "You taught me to think, ma'am." "I did," Hayes said softly. "And I'll keep fighting for that right, but the people above us won't like it." Susan's jaw tightened. "They never do." Hayes gave a faint, almost sad smile. "Be careful, Lieutenant. The closer you get to being irreplaceable, the more some will want to prove you are." 2 weeks later, new orders came. Joint exercise with an Allied Special Forces unit in Turkey, live simulation, unknown opposition. To the outside world, just another training run. To Susan, it felt like something else. Nancy noticed it too. "They're watching us," she muttered as they packed gear. "They always were," Susan replied. Still they went. Because soldiers don't refuse orders. Even when those orders start to smell like traps. The exercise began at dawn in an abandoned coastal refinery. Rusted catwalks, maze-like corridors, a forest of pipes. Perfect sniper terrain. Too perfect. The scenario, hostile capture rescue. Rules, simulation rounds, no live fire. Opposing force, undisclosed. Susan took the west tower. Nancy covered the eastern approach. Wind howled through broken windows, carrying the salt of the sea. Through her scope, Susan saw figures moving, too disciplined, too silent for regular trainees. Not allies. Professionals. Her gut twisted. "This isn't a drill," she whispered. "Confirmed," Nancy said. "Pattern looks SEAL." The realization hit like a flashbang. They sent them against the very same unit from Novgorod, O'Hare's team. Testing loyalty. Testing restraint. Command came over the line. "Engage hostile units. Live rounds authorized." Susan's finger hovered over the trigger. The order was clear. The test clearer. They wanted to see if the Ghost Sisters would pull the trigger this time. She aimed center mass, perfect shot. Then she remembered the boy in the observatory. And the sound of him crying. "No," she said quietly. Nancy's voice came through, calm but certain. "Then let's change the rules." They fired, but not at bodies. Rounds snapped through radio antennas, optics, weapon stocks. Precision chaos. Below, the SEALs scrambled for cover, shouting orders. No one hit. No one dead. Just confusion, the same dance as Novgorod all over again. Hours later, smoke filled the compound. The exercise was over, and the aftermath was colder than the sea wind. Inside the debrief tent, senior officers watched the replay in silence. Perfect hits, 0 casualties. Again. Hayes sat at the far end, expression unreadable. One general leaned forward, voice sharp. They ignored a lawful order to engage. "Correction," Hayes said evenly. "They interpreted it." The room bristled. Another general snapped. "You've built an ideology around insubordination." "No," Hayes replied. "I've built a standard around conscience." That night Susan sat outside her quarters, boots unlaced, staring at the stars scattered above the desert. Every light looked like a choice she hadn't made. Nancy joined her quietly, dropping beside her with 2 cups of coffee. For a while they didn't speak. Finally Nancy said, "They'll come for Hayes next, you know that, right?" Susan nodded. She knew it too. They sat in the stillness, listening to the hum of generators and faraway laughter from recruits who still believed wars had winners. Nancy's voice softened. "What do we do now?" Susan looked at her partner, the friend who'd bled beside her, doubted with her, survived everything the system threw at them. "Same thing we've always done," she said. "Hold the line, even if no one else can see it." Nancy smiled faintly. "And if they order us to cross it?" Susan took a slow breath. "Then we make sure history remembers which side we stood on." The desert wind rose again, carrying the faint echo of gunfire from the range, young recruits firing into the dark, chasing ghosts they didn't know by name. And somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the horizon, promising another storm. Because battles don't end when the shooting stops. They just change their language. When a storm hits, it never asks who deserves the rain. The message came before dawn. No briefing, no salute. Just a single line on the secure network. Call AMHAYES, relieved of command. Susan read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. Nothing ever does when the knife goes in clean. She sat motionless in the barracks, light from the tablet flickering across her face. Outside, the desert wind howled against tin roofs, scattering dust like ash. Nancy stood in the doorway, hair pulled back, already dressed for the range. She's gone. Effective immediately, Susan said quietly. Nancy exhaled. They finally did it. Neither spoke for a while. When people say soldiers serve the flag, they forget the truth. You don't serve cloth. You serve the few who still make you believe in it. Hayes had been that few. By mid-morning, the base felt wrong. Orders circulated with no signatures. Faces avoided eye contact. A new Colonel Madden arrived by helicopter, his uniform as stiff as his smile. He addressed the instructors in the hangar, voice clipped and efficient. Effective immediately, the Ghost program is suspended. All field activities frozen pending review. You'll receive reassignment within 72 hours. Reassignment. A clean word for exile. Susan stood at attention, expression blank. Nancy's fists were tight at her sides. The men in suits standing behind Madden didn't belong here. They smelled like bureaucracy and fear. When the meeting ended, Susan turned to leave. A hand grabbed her arm, an intelligence officer she didn't recognize. "Lieutenant Cuddy," he said, lowering his voice. "Command requests you and Lieutenant Love for immediate redeployment, off record." Nancy blinked, thought we were frozen. "Not anymore." He slipped a folder into Susan's hand. No insignia, no seal, just a name. Operation Glass Echo. They flew out that night in a twin-rotor transport under false call signs. Destination classified. Mission: recovery of a missing U.S. operative in Eastern Europe. Through the roar of engines, Nancy leaned close. "This feels wrong." "It's all that's left," Susan replied. She opened the folder under the red cabin light. Inside, a grainy satellite image of an old power plant and a photo that made her throat tighten. Colonel Anna May Hayes. Alive. Caption: held at unknown facility. Possible rendition attempt by rogue assets. Nancy stared at the picture. "They took her." Susan closed the folder. "Then we're taking her back." Snow was falling when they landed outside the shell of the Chernaris power station, an abandoned Cold War relic half buried in ice. The night was still, except for the hum of the turbines that somehow still worked. Too quiet for coincidence. They moved with two local guides who claimed to know the tunnels. But halfway through the approach, one disappeared into the dark. No struggle. Just gone. Susan clicked her comm. "Stay tight," sensors picking multiple heat signatures inside. Nancy checked her rifle. "How many?" "Too many." They breached the side entrance. And the world exploded in light. Flashbangs. Shouts. Rounds slicing the air. A trap. Again. They dove behind concrete pillars as bullets sparked against steel. "Contact left," Nancy yelled. "Copy." They returned fire in short, precise bursts, non-lethal where they could, lethal when they had to. Within minutes, silence returned. Susan's heart hammered, breath misting in the cold. She glanced down. A patch from one of the fallen attackers. U.S. Special Tactics Group. American. Her stomach dropped. "They're ours." Nancy's voice cracked in disbelief. "Then who's the enemy?" They pushed deeper into the plant, down corridors that smelled of oil and rot. Emergency lights flickered crimson, painting everything like a wound. Every step echoed. At the end of the hallway, A reinforced door stood half open. Inside, a single figure sat tied to a chair, head bowed. Susan approached slowly, rifle raised. "Colonel." Hayes looked up, bruised but conscious, her voice a rasp. "Took you long enough." Nancy rushed forward, cutting the restraints. "Jesus, ma'am, what happened?" Hayes managed a thin smile. "They called it questioning. I call it recycling. They wanted to see if I'd denounce the program, say it was a failure." She winced, rubbing her wrists. "I told them failure isn't something women invented." Susan's throat tightened. "We're getting you out." But Hayes shook her head. "Not yet. They're tracking this place. If you exfil now, they'll shoot you down before sunrise." "Then we hold until dark," Susan said. Hayes looked at her. "You always did love impossible math." They fortified the control room, rigging tripwires and setting up perimeter motion sensors. Snow drifted through shattered windows. The power grid hummed like a heartbeat. Outside, unseen engines roared in the distance, rotor blades cutting air. Nancy crouched beside a window, scanning the ridge. 3 birds incoming, no ID. "Extraction team." "No," she said, "they're not slowing down." Susan met Hayes's eyes. "They're coming to finish this." Hayes nodded, "Then make them remember why they never could." The assault came fast. Drones first, buzzing through the dark like hornets, then men in black armor pouring through the snow. Susan and Nancy moved in perfect synchrony, just like Novgorod. One spotting, one firing, every round deliberate. They didn't kill unless forced. They didn't miss. Inside, Hayes worked the old comm terminal, rerouting power to an uplink tower. "What are you doing?" Susan shouted. "Sending the truth," Hayes said. "If I'm going down, they'll see what we built." The signal burst to life. Encrypted footage, mission data, field test results, all transmitting to servers across Allied networks. Proof that the Ghost program wasn't a myth. Outside, gunfire intensified. Nancy switched to thermal view. "Too many, Sue, we can't hold." Susan reloaded, grim. "Then we don't hold, we move." They set smoke charges, grabbed Hayes between them, and dashed through the maintenance tunnels as explosions rocked the upper floors. Snow blinded them when they emerged onto the ridge. The extraction point was half a kilometer downhill. Behind them, the power plant burned, orange against the white world. Rotor noise grew closer, 2 helicopters cresting the ridge, spotlights sweeping. Friendly or not, Susan didn't wait to ask. She fired a flare straight into the storm. The choppers banked hard, one turning toward them. Nancy shielded Hayes as snow whipped around them. A rope ladder dropped through the glare. They climbed, hands raw, muscles screaming. As they lifted off, Susan looked down. The facility below was gone in fire. Whatever secrets it held had burned clean. Hours later, in a safe house across the border, the 3 women sat wrapped in blankets, steam rising from mugs of instant coffee. Outside, dawn bruised the horizon. Hayes's face was pale but steady. "You transmitted everything," Susan said. Hayes nodded. "They'll bury it eventually, but not before a few people read it." Nancy rubbed her eyes. "Then what now? We just keep running." Hayes looked at both of them. "Running for the guilty. You're not guilty, you're inconvenient." She leaned forward, voice low. "They can take my command, my rank, my reputation, but they can't unprove what you did. Every bullet you didn't fire is a record now. Every life you spared is evidence." Susan met her gaze. "And when they come again?" Hayes smiled faintly. "Then you remind them, ghosts don't die twice." When night fell again, Susan stepped outside alone. The wind off the mountains was sharp, clean. For the first time in months, she felt something close to calm. She thought about the tower, the boy, the training fields, the faces of every soldier who doubted her. All of it led here, to this thin line between obedience and conscience. Behind her, Hayes and Nancy spoke softly, laughter drifting through the doorway, quiet, human, alive. Susan closed her eyes. Maybe that was the answer she'd been chasing all along. Not victory, not validation. Just the sound of people still breathing because she'd chosen restraint. In the distance, thunder rolled again. Another storm coming. Always another. She smiled to herself. Let it come, she whispered. We've already learned how to stand in the rain. What do heroes become when no one's allowed to say their names? 3 months had passed since the fire at Chernobyl. Enough time for governments to rewrite reports, for satellites to lose data, for official statements to say the operation never happened. But rumors have gravity. And somewhere in that gravity, the legend of the Ghost Sisters began to grow again. Susan hated it. In a safe house on the edge of the Adriatic coast, she spent her mornings fixing the same cracked rifle scope, and her nights watching the sea through a window with no curtains. The tide rolled in, the world rolled on, and she waited for something that felt like purpose to find her again. Nancy called it retirement. Susan called it purgatory. Hayes was recovering, her scars fatting her resolve not. She'd lost her stars but kept her spine. From the kitchen table she ran quiet channels, writing coded messages, making calls on untraceable lines. She never said who she was talking to, only that the right people still listen. One evening, Nancy walked into the room holding a newspaper printed in Cyrillic. Front page, blurred images from drone footage, 2 figures moving through snow, one carrying another. The headline read simply, "Ghosts Among Us." Susan didn't look up. "Let them chase ghosts," she said. Nancy dropped the paper on the table. "They're not chasing, they're hunting." Days stretched into weeks. They moved from one rented flat to another, small, forgettable places near ports and train yards. Never long enough to build a routine. Never safe enough to call home. In Split, they hid above a shuttered bakery that still smelled faintly of flour. In Tirana, a fisherman lent them his attic in exchange for protection that never came. Each place felt temporary, as though the world kept rejecting their existence. One night, Nancy sat on the balcony with a cigarette she didn't light. The city below was alive. Music, arguments, lovers, drunks. The kind of life she used to think she was protecting. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. Susan didn't turn from the window. Miss what? The noise, the orders, the certainty. Susan's reflection flickered in the glass. Certainty's just another weapon. They take it away when they're done using it. Nancy smiled faintly. "You've gotten poetic." "Just tired." Hayes entered then, her limp barely visible now. She placed a stack of envelopes on the table, each one sealed, stamped, unsigned. "I've been in touch with an old contact," she said. Susan raised an eyebrow. "Intelligence or press?" "Both," Hayes replied. "Seems the leak we sent out didn't die. Someone in Brussels picked it up. They're asking questions about non-lethal combat programs, about female integration statistics, about us." Nancy leaned forward. "So, what, you want to go public?" Hayes's smile was sharp. "I want the truth public. We don't have to say a word." Susan frowned. "Truth without names isn't truth." "Sometimes it's safer," Hayes said softly. "For who?" Susan asked. "For the next ones," Hayes answered. The room fell silent again. That was the thing about Hayes. Every answer she gave was a door you didn't realize you walked through until it closed behind you. Winter returned, and with it the ghosts. One night, Susan woke from a half-dream to the sound of waves slamming the breakwater below. In her dream, she was back in Novgorod. The tower collapsing, her leg burning, the sound of O'Hare shouting orders through static. Only this time, she didn't pull the trigger. And the city burned anyway. She sat up gasping, sweat cold on her skin. Nancy stirred across the room. Nightmare again. Yeah. Same one. Yeah. Nancy turned over. You should talk to Hayes, she says talking helps. Susan stared into the dark. Talking doesn't change what's done. Then what does? Susan's voice barely carried, doing it differently next time. But next time came sooner than anyone expected. One gray morning, a coded message arrived on the encrypted tablet Hayes still used. She read it once, her face tightening. What is it? Nancy asked. Hayes hesitated. They've found O'Hare. Susan looked up sharply. Where? Detained. Ankara. Interrogated for unauthorized missions. They're accusing him of fabricating Novgorod to justify field testing. Nancy's brow furrowed. He didn't fabricate anything. No, Hayes said, but he was the only official name attached to that op. Someone had to take the fall. They chose him. Susan's stomach turned cold. He's paying for what we did. Hayes nodded. They'll bury him the same way they tried to bury us. Silence fell like a verdict. Nancy finally said, So what do we do? Hayes met her eyes. Nothing, we stay invisible. Susan stood up slowly. No, not this time. Hayes's voice hardened. If you step into this, they'll find you. They'll find us. Susan turned toward the window, the sea glinting like liquid steel. Maybe that's what needs to happen. 2 days later, they were gone. Hayes woke to an empty table, a note scrawled in neat handwriting. If they come for truth, they'll hear it from us. She closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and began erasing every trace of them from her network. Ankara, a city of contradictions, mosques and markets, neon and silence. Susan and Nancy moved like ghosts again, slipping through back alleys, trading fake IDs for favors. The detention compound lay on the city's outskirts, concrete walls, floodlights, too many guards. They'd planned harder missions, but none that felt like betrayal wrapped in duty. From a rooftop across the street, Susan set her rifle. Nancy crouched beside her, spotting through binoculars. Cell 3B, that's him. Susan saw O'Hare through the barred window, head down, thinner, older. Even from here, she could tell he wasn't broken yet. What's the play? Nancy asked. Susan checked her watch. Same as Novgorod. Precision, confusion, no casualties. Nancy smiled faintly, full circle. The operation unfolded like choreography. Cameras disabled, floodlights shattered. Within minutes, alarms blared as the guards scrambled toward phantom threats. They slipped through shadows, cutting through fences and corridors until they reached the holding wing. O'Hare looked up as the door opened. Recognition flashed across his face. Cuddy, love. Come on, Susan said. We're getting you out. He stared at them like they were ghosts. I thought you were. Dead? Yeah, we get that a lot. They moved fast, but time never moves fast enough. By the time they reached the outer gate, sirens were screaming, and vehicles were converging from every direction. Extraction routes blocked, Nancy said. O'Hare turned to them. You can still run, I can't. Susan grabbed his arm, not leaving anyone behind. Then headlights flooded the alley. Black SUVs. Doors opening. Men with rifles. Susan and Nancy raised theirs instinctively, but the figures didn't shoot. One of them stepped forward, hands visible. A familiar voice. Female. Calm. Stand down. Hayes. She walked into the light, face unreadable. I told you not to come, she said quietly. Susan stared, disbelief mixing with relief and anger. You set this up. I finished it, Hayes replied. They wanted proof you were alive. Now they have it, and now we negotiate. Hours later, in a secured compound owned by an unnamed agency, the four of them sat at a long steel table. No chains, no guards, just cameras in the corners and truth in the air. O'Hare looked at Hayes. So this is it, the end of the ghost program. Hayes shook her head. No, it's the beginning of the part we don't control. Nancy leaned back. So what happens to us? Hayes's eyes softened. You go where the noise can't reach you for a while. She slid a small drive across the table to Susan. Every file, every image, every mission. The truth. If they ever come for you again, don't fight, just show them this. Susan took it, staring at the metal glinting under the lights. This won't stop them. No, Hayes said, but it might make them hesitate. That night before they were relocated to another safe site, Susan stood on the rooftop, wind tugging at her hair. O'Hare joined her, his voice rough. You know, you changed the way a lot of us think out there. She smiled faintly. Took long enough. He nodded. We used to say ghosts don't bleed. You proved they do, and that's what makes them dangerous. He offered his hand. She took it. For a moment the world felt even. Down below, Nancy and Hayes loaded their gear into an unmarked van. The engines idled. Another night, another escape. Susan looked once more at the horizon, at the faint line where city lights met the dark sky. So much noise. So much pretending. She whispered, mostly to herself. Maybe being a ghost isn't about disappearing. Maybe it's about being the thing they can't erase. Then she turned, walking into the shadows where the others waited. Together they drove into the night, 3 women and 1 man bound by silence, purpose, and the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout to survive. What happens to the ghosts after the war ends? No one knew where the ghost sisters went after Ankara. The report stopped. The missions vanished. Even their files turned to ash inside vaults that officially never existed. But some stories refuse to die. They just wait for the right silence to echo in. 5 years later, in a quiet coastal town on the edge of Portugal, the sea still sounded the same as it had that night in the Adriatic, endless, indifferent, honest. A small cafe sat on the promenade, sunlight warming its wooden tables. Susan and Cuddy ran it now. No signs, no symbols, just coffee, bread, and a view of the horizon. Most mornings she opened before dawn. Same way she used to before a mission. Habit was a kind of prayer. The regulars didn't know who she'd been. They just knew she had that look, the kind soldiers carry long after they've stopped wearing the uniform. Calm eyes, steady hands, a sadness too patient to be noticed by those who hadn't earned it. Nancy visited sometimes, always without warning. She'd show up on a rented bike, helmet under one arm, sunburned and grinning. Still hiding, she'd tease. Still running, Susan would reply. Then they'd sit on the balcony, 2 ghosts sharing laughter over strong coffee and the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Hayes never came. But every few months, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside were clippings, articles, transcripts, classified documents somehow leaked to the press. One of them, dated 2 years after Ankara, carried a headline that made Susan stop mid-sip. Pentagon confirms gender-integrated sniper program after leaked footage reveals unnamed female operatives. No names. No faces. Just validation, quiet, buried in bureaucratic language but real. Nancy read it twice, smiling. Told you, truth doesn't need a mouth, just a spine. Susan folded the article and placed it inside a wooden box under the counter, alongside a faded photo of her and Nancy at the range, their rifles slung, their eyes tired but alive. The box also held her dog tags, scratched and cold, and the silver star she'd never worn. She didn't need reminders. She lived them. One autumn afternoon, a familiar shadow entered the cafe. O'Hare, older, thinner, his posture still impossibly straight. He wore civilian clothes, but the way he scanned the exits gave him away instantly. Susan looked up from the espresso machine. "Lieutenant," he greeted softly. "Captain," she corrected with a half-smile. "Retired," he said. They sat outside, the sea whispering against the rocks. For a while they said nothing. The sun was setting, one of those amber burns that makes the whole world look like it's on the verge of remembering something important. Finally O'Hare said, "They wrote us out of everything. Novgorod, Chernaris, Ankara, all gone." Susan nodded. "Good, maybe it means we did it right." He studied her, still believed that. She met his gaze. "I have to." He reached into his jacket and slid a small envelope across the table. Inside, a medal, different from the one she'd buried under wood and dust. A unit commendation stamped with the seal of Special Operations Command. Unsigned, unclaimed. "They sent that to me," O'Hare said. "Said it belonged to all of us. Figured you know what to do with it." Susan turned it over in her hands. The metal was smooth, heavy. "A mirror if you look close enough." She set it down gently. "Let it stay unclaimed. Some things mean more that way." O'Hare nodded. "You know, for years I thought war was about proving who can pull the trigger first. And now I think it's about who chooses not to." He smiled, that tired soldier's smile that carries both pride and apology. "Be seeing you, Ghost." "Not if I see you first," she said. He left without looking back. He didn't need to. Some bonds don't need distance to stay intact. That night the rain came, the first in months. The kind that makes the air electric, alive. Susan stood outside under the awning, watching the drops hit the cobblestones. The smell of wet salt and thunder rolled through the air. Nancy's voice echoed in her head. Maybe being a ghost isn't about disappearing. Maybe it's about being the thing they can't erase. Susan smiled faintly. The world had erased her name. But not her choice. Inside, the radio played softly, some old folk song about home and oceans. She turned it up just a little. Sometimes you needed noise to remember you, survive the quiet. A week later, a letter arrived with no return address. The handwriting was Hayes's, elegant, sharp, unshaken by age. Inside was a single line, written in pen that had bled slightly from travel. "They can write history how they like. We already lived it." And below it, no signature. Just a small pressed flower, dried and fragile. Susan placed it beside the old medal, closed the box and locked it again. Years drifted by like the tide. The cafe stayed open. People came and went. Sometimes a young woman in uniform stopped in, curious about the photographs on the wall. Mountains, rifles, the sea. "Were you in the military?" they asked. Susan would smile softly. "Something like that." And when they'd leave, she'd watch them go with quiet pride. Because she could see it, the difference. The world had shifted, even if no one knew who had pushed it. Women in sniper units. Female instructors in combat schools. Names she didn't recognize, but spirits she did. Every one of them walking through a door she and Nancy had once kicked open in the dark. One evening, as the sky turned violet, Nancy returned again, older now, a streak of silver in her hair. They sat outside with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like memory. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" Nancy asked. Susan thought for a long time. "Sometimes, but then I look around and I see what changed because it didn't." Nancy nodded. "Guess that's enough." They sat in silence until the stars began to appear, one by one, steady, patient, distant. Nancy looked up. "You ever think about the people who'll never know our names?" Susan smiled. "They don't have to." She turned her gaze toward the horizon. That's the thing about ghosts. You don't see them, but they keep you safe all the same. When the night deepened and the streets emptied, Susan locked the cafe and lingered a moment longer outside. The rain had stopped. The air was clean. She could hear the ocean breathing, the same way it had the night she'd whispered, "Let it come." And for the first time in years, she felt peace. Not victory, not pride, just peace. Because somewhere out there, in training grounds and battlefields she'd never see, someone else was whispering wind speeds, adjusting for distance, choosing a shot that saved instead of ended. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She looked down at her hands, the faint scars catching the streetlight. These were the hands that once shook as she chose mercy over certainty. The same hands that had written history without permission. She whispered almost to herself. Some targets aren't meant to fall, they're meant to understand. The next morning, the cafe opened again. The sea glowed gold. And in the distance, a lone gull traced slow circles over the water, as if searching for someone who had already become part of the air itself. Susan poured the first cup of coffee, the steam curling like smoke from a rifle barrel long cooled. She glanced at the empty chair across the table, smiled faintly, and whispered one last truth for no one in particular. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that she turned toward the sunrise. Not as a ghost, but as what she had always been. A soldier, a woman, and the quiet proof that mercy can be aimed as steady as any bullet.